He said it on Friday night, while I sat surrounded by death certificates and my brother's unfinished eulogy. I did not argue or cry. I simply said, "I understand." But at the funeral the next morning, a hand-delivered manila envelope turned his callous words into his impending ruin. When he texted later about dinner, the horrifying truth clicked into place. He was not absent because he was sad. He stayed away because he was terrified. My name is Peyton Hughes. I am 34 years old, and my life, up until the moment it all shattered, was a temple of absolute order and unwavering predictability. I work as a contract audit specialist at Rivermark Civic Utilities, a municipal infrastructure agency that manages the electrical grid, the water lines, and the heavy public works for a massive stretch of North Carolina. My days are meticulously measured in compliance checks, vendor verifications, and strict procurement timelines. I sit in a quiet, temperature-controlled office with fluorescent lights humming above me, staring at spreadsheets that dictate how a city functions. I do not deal in feelings, and I certainly do not deal in vague intuition. I live by the undeniable weight of physical evidence. I am not an impulsive woman. I have never been the type of person to drop everything for a sudden, unplanned road trip or to make a major life decision based on a fleeting gut feeling. I find a deep, abiding peace in the things that can be physically measured, rationally quantified, and legally proven. I like clean audit reports. I like binding contracts where every single clause is clearly defined, heavily scrutinized, and rigidly adhered to. I need invoices to match the original purchase orders down to the absolute final cent. In the high-stakes world of public utilities, there is simply no gray area. A contractor either poured the foundation concrete to the exact safety specifications of the architectural blueprint, or they did not. A vendor either delivered the structural steel at the specifically agreed-upon price point, or they did not. I liked that ironclad certainty. It was a rigid, sometimes exhausting framework, but it was safe. I built my entire adult life around the profound comfort of knowing that if you follow the correct procedures and check the right boxes, you will always arrive at the correct, logical outcome. My brother, Evan Hughes, lived entirely on the opposite side of the human spectrum. He was 29 years old, and he was everything I was not. Evan was a commercial electrician, a man whose hands were heavily calloused, knuckles permanently scarred, always carrying a faint, lingering scent of wire sealant, copper dust, and industrial grease. He was loud, he was effortlessly funny, and he possessed a reckless, sprawling kind of kindness that I frequently warned him would eventually get him taken advantage of by a cruel world. Evan spent his days pulling heavy-duty cables through the sweltering, unventilated guts of half-finished commercial builds, or hanging suspended in safety harnesses to fix overhead electrical grids in massive, freezing warehouses. It was brutal, back-breaking labor, but his evenings and his weekends were an entirely different story. Those precious hours of rest were routinely given away for free. If an elderly military veteran living 3 towns over had his aging furnace go out in the dead of January, Evan was there in his battered pickup truck before the sun even came up. If a single mother in his cramped apartment complex could not afford the extortionate emergency call-out fee when her breaker panel started smoking in the middle of the night, Evan showed up at her door with his heavy leather tool bag and a reassuring, easygoing smile. He absolutely refused to ask for a single dime from people who were already struggling to keep their heads above water. He firmly believed that if you possessed a tangible skill that kept people warm and safe, you had a strict moral obligation to use it for good. We were fiercely close. We grew up protecting each other, and as adults, he remained the grounding anchor I did not even know I needed. He was the chaotic, vibrant warmth that perfectly balanced out my sterile, highly regimented corporate world. Every Sunday evening, without fail, my phone would ring. We treated those weekly phone calls like a sacred, unbreakable ritual. We would spend a solid hour just complaining to each other. I would vent extensively about the mind-numbing bureaucratic nightmares of my desk job, detailing the sheer agony of tracking down missing compliance signatures from lazy contractors. He would groan loudly about the physical exhaustion of his trade, describing the searing heat of a poorly managed job site or a foreman who did not understand basic safety protocols. We would passionately, loudly debate the Carolina Panthers' perpetually tragic offensive line, and we waged an endless, unwinnable war over whose homemade chili recipe was superior. He claimed my secret ingredient of dark chocolate made the dish taste like a confused, terrible dessert, while I stubbornly maintained that his heavy reliance on raw ghost peppers was just a ridiculous, macho attempt to permanently destroy our taste buds. He was my absolute best friend. I loved him more than anyone else on this earth. Then, there was Grant. Grant Mercer was 37 years old, currently serving as the Director of External Relations for Grayline District Partners. Grayline was a massive, highly influential real estate development firm that was rapidly reshaping the downtown commercial skyline with sleek, multi-million-dollar high-rises. Grant was a man constructed entirely of smooth, sharp angles, impeccably tailored wool suits, and heavily calculated charm. He spoke in polished, rhythmic paragraphs that sounded exactly like they had been carefully drafted by an entire public relations team. He knew exactly how long to hold eye contact to convey deep sincerity, exactly which silver fork to use at a high-stakes corporate fundraising gala, and exactly when to deploy a perfectly calibrated, disarming smile to immediately diffuse any rising tension in a crowded room. We had been dating for exactly 16 months, on paper, and certainly to the outside observing world. We made perfect, logical sense. We were both driven, highly successful professionals expertly navigating the modern corporate landscape. But over the slow course of those 16 months, I had started to catch small, deeply unsettling glimpses of the cold, relentless machinery operating just beneath Grant's flawless, smiling exterior. He was pathologically obsessed with optics. Everything in his entire life had to look exactly right. His daily schedule was curated not for personal joy, relaxation, or even basic efficiency, but strictly for the narrative it projected to the world around him. Every single dinner reservation we made, every casual weekend trip we took to the coast, every brief interaction with potential investors, high net worth clients, or even our closest mutual friends felt like a theatrical, scripted scene he was actively directing in real time. If we went to a new, trendy restaurant, he cared far less about the actual quality of the food arriving at our table, and far more about whether we were seated in the correct, highly visible section, ensuring we were seen by the right demographic of influential people. It was an incredibly exhausting, hollow way to live, but I stubbornly reasoned that it was simply a necessary, unavoidable byproduct of surviving his high-pressure, cutthroat career. Evan never explicitly said he hated Grant. My brother was simply too polite, too fundamentally decent for that kind of open, messy hostility, but Evan always maintained a careful, highly deliberate physical and emotional distance whenever Grant was around. If Grant confidently offered Evan a perfectly poured, expensive craft beer during a weekend visit, Evan would politely take the glass, offer a tight, courteous smile, and immediately drift toward the complete opposite side of the room to strike up a conversation with literally anyone else. I remember one specific Tuesday evening vividly. It was a casual, comfortable family dinner at my parents' house in the suburbs. Grant had just politely excused himself early to take what he gravely described as a critical, time-sensitive conference call, leaving a lingering, heavy scent of expensive, imported cologne in the front hallway. Evan was leaning casually against the kitchen counter, quietly wiping down the granite surfaces with a damp cloth. He looked toward the heavy oak front door where Grant had just exited, gave a quiet, knowing chuckle, and turned to look directly at me. He was half joking, trying to keep the mood light, but his dark eyes were entirely serious when he finally spoke. "I do not know about that guy. Peyton. He is the kind of man who stands in a room but still seems like he is writing a speech for himself." I brushed the comment off immediately. I rolled my eyes and confidently told Evan he was just playing the classic, tired cliché role of the overprotective younger brother who firmly believes no man on earth is ever going to be quite good enough for his older sister. I was incredibly, blindingly arrogant about my own personal judgment back then. I was a senior professional auditor, After all, my entire established career, my entire core identity, was built squarely on spotting hidden discrepancies, uncovering buried, ugly flaws, and meticulously reading the invisible fine print that everyone else lazily missed. I genuinely, truly believed I was far too rational, far too observant, to ever be foolishly taken in by a bad, manipulative man. If there was a real, foundational problem with Grant Mercer's core character, I told myself with absolute, unwavering confidence, I would have seen the glaring red flags from a mile away. I would have instantly cataloged them, thoroughly analyzed them, and filed them away accordingly. It is precisely that staggering, blinding arrogance that makes looking back so deeply, physically humiliating. When the catastrophic collapse finally arrived, it was not merely the sad, quiet death of a modern romance. It was a complete, violent, and utter shattering of my own perceived reality. It was the terrifying, suffocating realization that I had fundamentally, completely misread the human being sitting directly across the dinner table from me for well over a year. I had spent my entire professional life demanding hard evidence and verifying cold facts, yet I had completely disastrously failed to see the hollow, calculating void living inside the man I thought I loved. The foundation was already rotten, completely decayed from the inside out, but I was far too busy checking the surface paperwork to notice the entire building was about to violently collapse right on top of me. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk, running a final compliance check on a massive municipal bid package for a water treatment facility. My highlighter was hovering over a discrepancy in a subcontractor timeline. Then, my phone rang. It was my father. He never called me during work hours. I answered. He said my name, just my name. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. It was hollow, scraped clean of any recognizable warmth. He told me Evan was gone. The words did not make sense. They hung in the sterile air of my office, completely divorced from reality. Evan had been working on a massive warehouse renovation project down on the coast, in a city called Port Alder. According to the initial, fragmented reports my father received, Evan stayed after hours to run a final diagnostic check on a newly wired auxiliary electrical system. He was standing on a heavy industrial freight lift. The lift suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. It went into a freefall. Evan dropped 3 stories straight down onto the concrete subfloor. He was killed instantly. I dropped my pen. It hit the desk with a sharp, loud crack. I did not scream. I did not cry. My entire body simply went numb. I stood up, grabbed my car keys, and walked out of the building. I left my computer monitor glowing. I left my coffee cup half full. I do not have any memory of the drive to my parents' house. I do not remember stopping at red lights, changing lanes, or navigating the highway. I only remember the crunch of gravel under my tires as I pulled into their driveway. My childhood home had already been transformed into a suffocating holding cell for grief. The chaos was absolute, and it was immediate. There were flowers arriving from people we barely knew, their heavy, sweet scent instantly making the living room smell like a funeral parlor. There were endless legal documents to sign. The phone rang constantly with calls from the county medical examiner, the funeral home director, the state occupational safety board, and local union representatives. A steady stream of well-meaning relatives and neighbors walked through the front door, carrying baked goods and casseroles, offering empty, awkward platitudes because no one actually knew what to say when a 29-year-old man was crushed to death. Evan was not married. He did not have children. He had no official next of kin other than my parents. My mother collapsed inward, entirely non-functional. She sat in the corner of the living room, staring blankly at a blank television screen, clutching one of Evan's old high school football jerseys. My father paced the kitchen floor, his jaw tight, his eyes red, desperately trying to project strength while his hands shook violently every time he picked up the phone. I stepped into the void. I had to. I took over. I became the project manager of my brother's death. It was the only way I could keep my own mind from snapping in half. I applied my professional auditor skills to the worst tragedy of my life. I organized the paperwork into strict categories. I handled the life insurance policy inquiries. I dealt with the aggressive union representatives who were already building a timeline of the accident. I sat down with the funeral director and coldly selected a casket, chose a burial plot, and arranged the floral sprays, negotiating the costs as if I were reviewing a vendor contract at work. I survived those first 3 days by completely detaching my emotions from my physical actions. Through that initial blinding storm, Grant appeared to be doing everything exactly right. He called me immediately after I sent him a brief text message explaining what happened. His voice was appropriately low, soothing, and entirely supportive. He told me how incredibly sorry he was. He sent a massive arrangement of white lilies to my parents' house. He texted me late at night, saying, "I am here if you need me, whatever you need." He asked practical questions. He inquired about the specific time of the memorial service. He asked what color suit would be most appropriate for the weather and the tone of the event. I felt a profound, heavy wave of relief wash over me. I thought to myself that at least in this one specific area of my life, I had not made a terrible mistake. I firmly believed that profound trauma possessed a unique ability to strip away the superficial gloss of any relationship, exposing the true, solid foundation underneath. Grant was stepping up. He was playing the role of the supportive partner perfectly. I leaned on that thought to keep myself standing. We scheduled the funeral for Saturday morning. It was exactly 4 days after the accident. My parents could not bear the thought of dragging the agonizing process out any longer than absolutely necessary. They just wanted Evan to be at peace. They wanted him resting in the ground so they could finally stop talking to strangers about his ruined body. On Friday night, the house finally fell quiet. The neighbors had gone home. The phone stopped ringing. My parents had retreated to their bedroom, exhausted by a grief so heavy it felt radioactive. I was sitting alone at the large oak dining room table. I was surrounded by towering stacks of death certificates, medical examiner reports, and caterer invoices. The only light in the room came from my laptop screen. I was drafting Evan's eulogy. I had been staring at the same blinking cursor for 2 solid hours, trying to figure out how to compress 29 years of a loud, vibrant, beautiful life into a standard 5-minute speech. I was exhausted. My eyes burned. My hands felt like lead. Then, my cell phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up in the dark room. It was Grant calling. I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear, desperate for a comforting voice. I was ready to hear him tell me that he loved me, that he would be standing right beside me the next morning, that I was not alone in this suffocating nightmare. I was ready to lean on the man I thought I knew. I said hello. And in the span of a single, brief conversation, Grant Mercer systematically destroyed the very last illusion I held about him. I stared at the unfinished paragraph on my laptop screen and waited for him to explain himself. "Hey," Grant said. His voice was smooth, carrying that familiar, polished cadence he used when closing a difficult negotiation or massaging a nervous investor. "How are you holding up tonight?" "I am surviving," I replied, my eyes scanning the incomplete sentences on my laptop screen. "Just finishing the eulogy. It is harder than I thought it would be." Trying to sum him up, there was a slight pause on the line, a brief, highly calculated intake of breath, the kind of breath a person takes right before they pivot the conversation to serve their own needs. "Listen, Peyton," he started, the tone shifting into something carefully measured and profoundly reasonable. "I have been doing a lot of thinking about tomorrow morning, looking at the schedule and considering the emotional bandwidth required, and I have decided it is probably best if I do not attend the service." My fingers stopped hovering over the keyboard. The words on the bright screen blurred together. I did not process the sentence immediately. It felt like he was speaking a foreign language. "What did you say?" "I just do not think it makes sense for me to be there," he continued smoothly, operating entirely on his own logic, as if explaining a minor scheduling conflict regarding a lunch meeting. I mean, if we are being completely honest with each other, I barely knew Evan. We were not exactly close. We did not share a bond. and I really do not want to sit in a room full of depressing energy. It is just a lot to take on. I did not say anything. I simply could not form a single word. My brain was actively rejecting the audio it was receiving. He filled the silence, his confidence growing as he successfully justified his absence out loud. Funerals are just very heavy. Peyton, they are incredibly draining, and frankly, they are bad for mental health. It is a toxic environment to willingly subject yourself to. I want to be a supportive partner. I really do. But I think I can do that much better by being there for you afterwards. You know, when things are less dark. When you have processed all this immediate grief and we can actually communicate, he let out a soft, encouraging sigh, the kind you give to a child who is upset over a broken toy. In fact, why do we not plan for Sunday night? That new Italian place just opened up downtown. We can get a quiet corner table, have a nice bottle of wine, and get you a change of scenery. It will be good for you to step away from all the sadness and just breathe. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone across the dining room. I did not launch into a passionate, tearful defense of basic human decency or beg him to understand what it meant to bury the person you loved most in the entire world. I did not demand that he act like a man. I sat perfectly, entirely still. The house was quiet, save for two distinct, rhythmic sounds. The low mechanical hum of the central air conditioning unit kicking on in the hallway, and the heavy, shuffling footsteps of my father pacing back and forth on the concrete floor out in the garage. My father was walking off a pain he could not articulate, a grief that was currently crushing his chest, while the man I had been sleeping next to for over a year was casually, clinically opting out of it because the vibes were simply too negative. The silence stretched between us through the cellular connection. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. "Peyton?" Grant asked, a tiny sliver of irritation finally piercing his polished veneer. "Are you there?" "I understand," I said. My voice was entirely flat. It was stripped of all pitch, all emotion, and all affection. Grant immediately dropped his defensive posture. He had gotten the permission he sought. His voice softened into a gentle, almost patronizing coo. "Are you mad at me? Please tell me you are not mad. I just need to protect my own boundaries right now, and I need to know you are okay with that." It was a breathtaking, spectacular display of narcissism. In the middle of my family's absolute destruction, the single most pressing issue for Grant Mercer was his own emotional comfort and ensuring he did not have to feel guilty about his cowardice. He wanted me to absolve him. "No," I replied smoothly, staring blankly at the wall. "I am not mad." "Okay, good. I am so glad we are on the same page about this. I will call you Sunday to set up the reservation. Get some sleep, okay?" "Goodbye, Grant," I said, and I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. I set the device face down on the wooden table. I did not cry. My chest did not ache with the familiar, ragged tear of a broken heart. I did not feel the stinging rejection of a failed relationship. What happened inside my body in that exact second felt entirely mechanical. It felt exactly like a heavy, industrial iron lock rotating sharply into a new, permanent position, a thick steel door sliding shut and sealing tight against a concrete frame. The woman who loved Grant Mercer, the woman who made excuses for his vanity and his corporate superficiality, simply ceased to exist in that dining room. The auditor took over. The professional who assessed deficits and calculated liabilities stepped forward. I pulled my hands back to the keyboard, a profound coldness spreading through my veins, and I finished my brother's eulogy with a mind as clear and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. The morning of the funeral broke with a harsh, glaring sunlight that felt entirely inappropriate for the occasion. We arrived at the memorial chapel 45 minutes early, assuming we would need plenty of quiet time to arrange ourselves before a modest, expected group of family members and a few close friends arrived. We were entirely, completely wrong. When the heavy oak doors opened to the public, a massive, overwhelming tide of humanity poured inside. The entire chapel filled to its maximum capacity within 15 minutes, and people immediately began lining the back walls, standing shoulder to shoulder, spilling out into the foyer. I stood at the front near the casket, shaking hands, and watching the undeniable, physical proof of my brother's life walk down the center aisle. There were dozens of his coworkers, their faces scrubbed clean of construction dust, wearing dark suits that looked slightly uncomfortable and tight across their broad shoulders. The entire local union crew showed up, walking together in a tight, silent block of absolute solidarity, their hard hats left in their trucks. Old neighbors from our childhood street, people my parents had not seen in over 10 years, arrived with red eyes and fierce, tight embraces. A man in a sharply pressed, older military suit approached me. He introduced himself as a retired Marine. He told me, his voice trembling heavily, about the time Evan spent 3 full days completely rewiring his damp, dangerous basement, explicitly refusing to take a single dollar for the extensive labor and materials. A few minutes later, the owner of an independent auto repair shop introduced himself. He had only known Evan for exactly 6 months, having met him briefly while waiting in line at a local hardware store, yet he closed his entire busy shop for the entire day just to come pay his respects to a man who had helped him jump-start a stalled truck in the rain. Row after row, the polished wooden pews filled with the people whose lives Evan had touched, fixed, or brightened. The room was not full of depressing energy. It was overflowing with profound, staggering love. It was a physical manifestation of a life lived entirely for others. I looked at the empty spaces. I watched the heavy doors. I waited for a floral delivery that never came. Grant did not show up. As the service began and the minister took the podium, my phone sat completely silent in my black leather purse. There was no morning text message asking how I was holding up. There was no quick check-in to see if my parents needed anything to drink. There was no elaborate wreath of expensive flowers bearing his name near the altar. There was absolutely nothing. He had completely erased himself from the worst day of my life, effectively washing his hands of my grief because it did not fit into his perfectly curated, stress-free weekend schedule. He thought he was simply dodging an uncomfortable social obligation. He thought he was successfully managing his own convenience and protecting his precious mental health. He had absolutely no idea that by refusing to stand in that room, he had just handed me the exact clarity I needed to see him for what he truly was. The reception following the burial was held in the adjacent fellowship hall, a sprawling room filled with folding tables, lukewarm coffee, and the suffocating weight of collective mourning. I had just stepped away from the main gathering area, desperate for a single moment of unshared oxygen, when a young woman quietly blocked my path to the hallway. I recognized her instantly from the stories my brother used to tell. Her name was Tessa Vale. She was 26 years old, an apprentice electrician who had been shadowing Evan for the past 8 months. She looked entirely out of place in her stiff black dress, her calloused hands shifting nervously by her sides, her posture carrying the distinct rigidity of someone used to wearing a heavy tool belt. She glanced over her shoulder, ensuring we were isolated from the main crowd, before she reached into her oversized leather purse. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out a sealed brown manila envelope. She held it out to me, her eyes red and swollen. "I am so sorry. Peyton," Tessa whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. "I did not want to bother you today, with your parents and everything. But I have to give this to you right now. I cannot hold on to it anymore." I stared at the wrinkled brown paper, my mind too exhausted to process the sudden intrusion. "What is this, Tessa?" "It is from Evan," she replied, her voice dropping to an urgent, breathless pitch. "He gave it to me exactly 2 weeks ago. He made me put it in my locker at the site. He was acting really strange, really wound up. He looked me right in the eye and gave me a specific instruction." She swallowed hard, pushing the envelope into my hands. "He said, 'If anything happens to me, give this to Peyton, and do not give it to anyone else.'" The heavy paper felt like it was burning against my palms. I wanted to tear it open right there in the hallway, to consume whatever final words my brother had left behind, but a loud crash from the main room shattered the moment. My mother had collapsed against a folding table, knocking over a tray of water glasses, her legs finally giving out under the sheer, crushing gravity of the day. My father was scrambling to catch her, his face a mask of absolute terror, while dozens of well-meaning guests swarmed them with suffocating kindness. I had no choice. I folded the envelope in half, shoved it deep to the bottom of my purse, and ran back into the crowd to hold my family together. It was not until 10 o'clock that night that I finally returned to my own apartment. The space was completely dark, silent, and bitterly empty. I dropped my keys on the counter, kicked off my rigid black heels, and pulled the brown envelope from my bag. My hands were remarkably steady as I carried it to the kitchen island and turned on the overhead pendant light. I broke the seal and tipped the envelope upside down. 3 items slid out onto the cool quartz countertop. There was a standard silver USB drive. There was a folded photocopy of a heavily redacted site safety incident report, and there was a torn piece of lined notebook paper, covered in Evan's familiar, messy handwriting. I picked up the paper first. It was not a long letter. It was not an emotional goodbye or a heartfelt final wish. It was a single, terrifying directive. I read the words, and the air physically left my lungs. If Grant finds a way to avoid the funeral, do not let it go. A violent shudder ripped down my spine. The room suddenly felt freezing. My brother, dead from a mechanical failure, had perfectly predicted the precise, cowardly behavior of my boyfriend. This was not a coincidence. This was not a lucky guess about Grant's aversion to negative energy. Evan knew something, my grief, which had been a heavy, paralyzing blanket all day, instantly evaporated. It was replaced by something else entirely. The sharp, hyper-focused instinct of a professional auditor took control of my brain. I grabbed my laptop from my work bag, flipped it open on the kitchen island, and jammed the silver USB drive into the port. A folder popped up on the screen. It was simply titled with the name of the coastal city, Port Alder. I clicked it open. The first subfolder contained dozens of high-resolution photographs. They were pictures of the warehouse renovation site. I clicked through them rapidly. They were tight, detailed shots of the auxiliary electrical systems and the massive freight lift's housing unit. Even to an untrained eye, the heavy steel cables looked frayed, and the load-bearing brackets showed deep, rusted stress fractures. The second subfolder contained a sequence of forwarded internal corporate emails. They were communications between the primary construction contractor and Gray Line District Partners, Grant's firm. The emails discussed severe supply chain delays, mounting financial penalties, and the absolute necessity of pushing the project forward regardless of pending equipment inspections. Then, I saw the final file. It was an audio recording. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. I hovered the cursor over the play button, took a deep breath, and clicked it. The audio was slightly muffled at first, filled with the heavy, echoing background noise of a busy construction site, beeping machinery, shouting voices, and the hum of generators filled the speakers. Then, Evan's voice cut through the noise, sharp and agitated. "I am telling you, the load capacity on that lift is compromised," Evan said, his tone thick with frustration. "I cannot sign off on the auxiliary wiring if the main carriage is vibrating like that under a half load. It is a death trap. I am filing the safety observation." There was a brief pause on the recording. Then, another voice spoke. It was smooth. It was polished. It possessed that perfectly modulated, persuasive cadence that I had listened to across countless dinner tables and late-night phone calls. It was the voice of a man who firmly believed he could talk his way out of a burning building without ever breaking a sweat. It was Grant. "Let us take a breath, Evan." Grant's voice floated through my kitchen, dripping with condescension. "You are looking at this from a very narrow, purely mechanical perspective. This project is at a highly sensitive stage. A formal safety report of that magnitude should not surface before the investor pitch next week. It would create a cascading panic we simply cannot afford right now." "I do not care about your investors," Evan snapped back, the anger vibrating in his throat. "I care about the guys riding that platform. And Gray Line cares about them too," Obviously, Grant replied smoothly, completely unfazed. But there are proper channels for this. We are handling the equipment audits internally. You need to focus on your specific electrical contract and leave the engineering to the higher-ups. Do not make this a bigger issue than it needs to be. The audio file ended abruptly, plunging my kitchen back into a deafening silence. I sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the dark screen. The implications slammed into me like a physical blow. The entire foundation of my reality violently fractured and collapsed. Grant was not just a vain, emotionally stunted coward who wanted to avoid a depressing room. He was intricately, directly connected to the active suppression of a critical safety warning. He had stood on that job site, representing the financial interests of his massive development firm, and explicitly pressured my brother to bury the exact mechanical failure that ended up killing him. And then, he had the absolute audacity to call me, play the role of the supportive partner, and claim he could not attend the funeral because he barely knew Evan. He did not stay away because he was sad. He stayed away because he was terrified. He was terrified of walking into a room full of blue-collar workers, union representatives, and site managers who might have seen him arguing with my brother. He was terrified of being recognized. He was terrified of the truth bleeding out. Right at that exact second, the screen of my cell phone lit up on the counter. The bright, cheerful notification illuminated the dark kitchen. It was a text message from Grant. "So tomorrow at 7 at the new Italian place, still good? Cannot wait to see you and get your mind off things." I stared at the glowing white text bubble for a very long time. I looked at his name at the top of the screen. I thought about his perfect suits, his calculated smiles, and his pathetic, manufactured excuses. I thought about my brother falling 3 stories in the dark. I stayed perfectly still. Then I turned the phone face down on the cold quartz countertop without typing a single word in reply. Sunday evening arrived and departed without a single word from me. I did not show up at the new Italian restaurant. I did not send a text message to cancel the reservation. I left my phone sitting exactly where I had placed it on the cold quartz countertop, completely ignoring the 2 missed calls that came through right around 7 o'clock. By Monday morning, Grant shifted from mild confusion to recognizable annoyance. He sent a clipped message asking if I was deliberately ignoring him. By Tuesday afternoon, that annoyance had fully calcified into self-righteous irritation. He was no longer playing the role of the gently concerned partner. He was rapidly transitioning into the aggrieved victim, a man who felt he was being unjustly punished simply for trying to respect my emotional boundaries. The climax of his frustration arrived in the form of a voicemail left on my phone late Tuesday night. I sat at my kitchen island, the glowing screen of my laptop illuminating the dark room, and pressed play. "Peyton, this silent treatment is entirely uncalled for," his voice echoed from the small speaker, crisp and loaded with practiced corporate disappointment. "I am trying to give you the space you clearly need, but freezing me out is not fair to our relationship. You are processing your grief in a highly toxic manner right now. I understand you are hurting, but punishing the people who are trying to support you from a healthy distance is not the answer. Call me when you are ready to act like an adult and communicate." I listened to the entire message twice. I did not feel a sudden urge to cry. I did not feel the crushing weight of a broken heart. What I felt was a profound, icy wave of sheer disgust. The voicemail was a masterpiece of manipulative deflection. He was actively trying to pathologize my perfectly normal reaction to the sudden death of my brother, framing my silence as a character flaw so he would not have to examine his own cowardice. But more importantly, listening to his arrogant, polished voice cleared away the very last traces of brain fog I had been carrying since the accident. It made me incredibly razor-sharp awake. I deleted his voicemail and turned my full, undivided attention back to the files Evan had left behind. I spent the next 48 hours doing what I do best. I audited the ghost of my brother. I started by isolating the audio file. I right-clicked the document, pulled up the deep metadata properties, and extracted the exact digital timestamp of the recording. Then, I cross-referenced that specific date and time with the massive pile of subcontractor incident reports, daily site logs, and internal email chains stored in the folders on the Silver Drive. The results formed a perfect, horrifying straight line. The recorded argument between Evan and Grant took place exactly 8 days before the mechanical failure that sent my brother plunging 3 stories to the concrete subfloor. The documents painted a bleak, deeply frustrating picture of a young tradesman screaming into a bureaucratic void. Evan had not just complained once. He had officially flagged the heavy industrial freight lift 4 separate times over the course of 3 weeks. His daily logs detailed severe cable fraying, alarming structural vibrations under heavy load conditions, and a primary housing unit that was severely compromised by rust and lack of maintenance. But every single time Evan submitted a formal safety observation form, the paperwork was deliberately stalled. The documents showed a dizzying, intentional shell game of corporate deflection. The primary construction firm would receive Evan's report, mark it as pending review, and then officially bounce the liability down to a secondary mechanical subcontractor. That subcontractor would then file a request for an external engineering assessment, effectively kicking the can down the road for another 14 days. Grayline District Partners, the massive real estate development firm Grant represented, did not technically own or operate the heavy equipment on the site. On paper, they were completely insulated from the day-to-day physical hazards of the construction zone. However, the internal email chains Evan had managed to secure told a vastly different story about who was truly pulling the strings. Grayline was bleeding money on the Port Alder renovation. The project was already 2 months behind its original schedule due to early supply chain failures. More importantly, the emails revealed that Grayline was exactly 2 weeks away from hosting a massive, highly publicized site tour for a consortium of international investors. They were actively preparing to secure a second round of capital funding worth upwards of $50 million. A formal, state-mandated safety shutdown of the primary freight lift would have instantly halted all vertical construction on the site for a minimum of 10 days. It would have triggered an automatic, highly invasive inspection by the State Occupational Safety Board. The investor tour would have been disastrously canceled. The $50 million in capital funding would have vanished into thin air. Grant Mercer was the Director of External Relations. His entire job, his entire professional existence, relied entirely on ensuring the optics of the project remained flawless. When Evan threatened to bypass the stalling subcontractors and file a formal grievance that would trigger an automatic work stoppage, Grant was dispatched to the site to personally manage the problem. He was sent to silence a loud, stubborn electrician before the investors arrived. The final, sickening piece of the puzzle locked perfectly into place. I suddenly understood exactly why Grant had flatly refused to attend the funeral on Saturday morning. It had absolutely nothing to do with avoiding a room full of depressing energy. It was a cold, calculated risk assessment. Grant knew that Evan was highly respected by his peers. He knew the memorial service would be heavily populated by the exact same union laborers, site foremen, and apprentice electricians who spent every day on that coastal job site. He was terrified that someone in that crowd, perhaps a young apprentice who frequently shadowed Evan, had witnessed their heated argument 8 days prior. He could not risk walking into a room and being recognized as the corporate suit who explicitly pressured Evan to ignore a fatal safety hazard. A lesser, more impulsive woman would have grabbed her purse, driven straight to the local police precinct, and slammed the Silver Drive onto a detective's desk. But I was not an impulsive woman. I was a senior contract audit specialist. My professional instincts immediately overrode my emotional outrage. I knew exactly how the legal system worked when millions of dollars and powerful corporate entities were involved. A single, slightly muffled audio recording and a handful of forwarded emails were entirely circumstantial. Grant and the massive legal team at Grayline would simply claim the audio was taken out of context. They would argue that Grant was merely discussing general project timelines, not explicitly ordering a worker to operate faulty machinery. They would bury the local police in thousands of pages of redacted contracts, actively confusing the chain of command until reasonable doubt was firmly established. If I wanted to tear down a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar corporate cover-up, I needed significantly more than a smoking gun. I needed an ironclad, inescapable cage built entirely of their own paperwork. I transformed my quiet, tidy apartment into a forensic war room. I drove to a massive office supply store and purchased heavy-duty binders, hundreds of clear plastic sleeves, color-coded index tabs, and a large laser printer. I systematically printed every single document from the drive. I created a massive linear timeline spreadsheet that tracked the exact movement of every safety report Evan submitted. I logged the name of every single manager who signed off on a delay. I color-coded the dates of Grayline's internal investor meetings and placed them directly next to the dates Evan's complaints were buried. I annotated the source code of every digital file, preserving the chain of custody with the exact same rigid discipline I used when auditing municipal water contracts. I was no longer a grieving sister crying over a tragic workplace accident. I was building a comprehensive, undeniable prosecution dossier. For the first time since my father called me on that terrible Tuesday morning, the crushing, suffocating weight on my chest began to lift. The agonizing, chaotic pain of losing my absolute best friend was still there. But it was no longer a useless, sprawling mess of despair. It had permanently hardened. It had crystallized into a weapon. My grief finally had a distinct direction. It had a highly specific, measurable objective, and most importantly, it had a name. Grant Mercer thought he could bury his liability under a pile of corporate bureaucracy and walk away from my family without a scratch. He was about to learn that he had chosen the wrong woman to lie to. Getting hold of Tessa required careful maneuvering. I waited until Tuesday evening, ensuring she was entirely off the clock and safely away from the prying eyes of site foremen. We agreed to meet at a decaying diner on the very edge of the county line, a place featuring flickering neon signs and cracked vinyl booths where no one from Grayline would ever accidentally walk in. Tessa arrived looking like she had aged 10 years in a single week. She ordered black coffee and gripped the thick ceramic mug so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. Evan was losing his mind those last 14 days, she confessed, her voice barely rising above the low hum of the diner refrigerator. He was not sleeping. He was constantly checking his own safety harness, double-looping his clips, constantly looking over his shoulder. He pulled me aside one afternoon and told me that if the truth about the lift load capacity actually blew up, some suits are going to panic a lot harder than the subcontractors. I leaned across the sticky laminate table. Who was he talking about? Tessa? I need a name. She chewed on her bottom lip, terrified of the answer, before finally speaking. Leon Voss. He was not a lowly subcontractor. Leon was a senior project manager directly on Grayline's payroll. According to Tessa, on the Monday evening right before the fatal shift, Evan and Leon had a vicious screaming match on the second floor of the unfinished warehouse. Leon had aggressively poked his index finger hard into Evan's chest, threatening to have him permanently blacklisted from every union job in the state for insubordination. I drove back to my apartment with my jaw clamped shut, my mind racing through the legal implications. I needed to see the official paper trail immediately. Utilizing a back-channel connection I had cultivated over 5 years at the Civic Utilities office, I quietly requested a digital copy of the union's preliminary accident investigation report. When the document finally arrived in my encrypted inbox, reading it made my blood run entirely cold. The language had been meticulously, surgically altered by someone who understood exactly how liability worked. My brother's 4 explicit, aggressive safety filings had been actively downgraded in the official narrative summary. They were no longer categorized as formal, urgent safety complaints that required immediate remediation. Instead, they were smoothly, legally relabeled as informal site observations. Someone had taken a massive, fatal legal liability and turned it into a casual, undocumented suggestion. I immediately opened a secure browser window and bypassed the basic municipal firewall to access the public zoning and planning database. I pulled up the entire historical file for the Port Alder renovation project. The metadata and the addendums told a story of absolute financial desperation. Gray Line had formally petitioned the City Planning Board for massive schedule extensions on 3 separate occasions over the past 8 months. Each time, they cited unavoidable, unforeseen global supply chain delays regarding raw materials. But as an auditor, I knew exactly how to read between the bureaucratic lines. The translation was crystal clear. Gray Line was violently bleeding capital. They were severely over-leveraged on their construction loans. If the site was forcibly shut down for a major structural investigation by the state, the daily default penalties written into their municipal contract would instantly bankrupt the specific subsidiary managing the development. They were cornered animals. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, rubbing my temples as the sheer scale of the deception settled over me. And then, a completely unrelated memory forcefully surfaced. It was a memory that made me physically nauseous, sending a wave of hot bile up my throat. It was a Friday night, roughly 6 weeks ago. Grant was sitting comfortably on my dark gray velvet sofa. He was holding a glass of my expensive Cabernet, casually unbuttoning the stiff collar of his tailored dress shirt after a long day at the corporate office. He had asked me, with a perfectly manufactured look of casual, loving interest, about the city's infrastructure review schedule. He specifically wanted to know how quickly the compliance office was currently processing municipal technical waivers related to the coastal districts. At the time, I had smiled. I had felt a warm, foolish flutter of affection, genuinely believing my boyfriend was finally taking a sincere, engaged interest in the tedious minutiae of my daily work. I had openly, happily explained our exact internal timeline. I told him precisely how backlogged our department was, and exactly how many business days it typically took for a flagged site violation to trigger a mandatory municipal work stoppage. I had literally handed him the entire regulatory playbook. The betrayal suddenly shifted dimensions. It mutated into something profoundly monstrous. It was no longer simply about a vain, cowardly man skipping a funeral because he lacked basic emotional depth. It was a calculated, predatory extraction of critical intelligence. He had sat in my living room, drank my wine, kissed my forehead, and listened intently to my stories about work strictly to calculate the exact window of time Gray Line had to clean up their forged paperwork before my own regulatory colleagues caught them. He had weaponized my blind trust, turning my own professional expertise into a defensive shield for his corporate corruption. He was managing me the exact same way he managed his high-yield investors. The stakes instantly became absolute. I understood with terrifying, diamond-cut clarity that a half-measure or an emotional outburst would completely destroy me. If I brought this to him privately, if I confronted him with my theories, my printed emails, and my color-coded spreadsheets, Grant would instantly deny every single syllable. He would look at me with deep manufactured pity. He would deploy his expensive crisis management lawyers to legally bury the evidence, discredit my mental state as grief-induced hysteria, and quietly erase Leon Voss from the corporate directory overnight. He would slip away, his hands perfectly clean, his suit perfectly pressed. But if I struck with absolute precision, if I orchestrated the final reveal flawlessly, he would not just lose a romantic relationship. He would lose his entire meticulously crafted existence. He would lose his prestigious job, his spotless industry reputation, his massive salary, and the lucrative future he was currently building over expensive dinners with high-net-worth investors. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to my brother right there in my quiet kitchen. There would be no tearful confrontations. There would be no private ultimatums. I was going to force the undeniable truth out into the blinding public light, dropping it directly into an arena where Grant Mercer could not adjust the camera angle, spin the narrative, or charm his way to the nearest exit. The law offices of Marla Kincaid occupied the entire 14th floor of a stark, modernist glass building downtown. I did not choose her name out of a random directory. I chose her because her firm possessed a brutal, heavily documented track record of tearing apart negligent construction conglomerates and winning massive wrongful death settlements. She was a veteran attorney who did not deal in emotional hand-holding. She dealt in hard, unyielding liability. I walked into her spacious corner office, entirely ignoring the panoramic view of the city skyline, and dropped 3 thick, heavily indexed black binders directly onto her mahogany desk. Marla was a formidable woman in her late 50s. Wearing a sharp navy suit and wire-rimmed glasses, she looked at the binders, then looked up at me, clearly expecting the disorganized, tearful rambling of a grieving relative. Instead, I sat down, kept my spine perfectly straight, and concisely walked her through the color-coded timelines, the discrepancy in the official accident reports, and the specific metadata extracted from the audio file. She opened the first binder. She traced her index finger down the printed spreadsheet where I had perfectly aligned Greyline's investor meetings with the dates of my brother's buried safety complaints. Marla leaned back in her heavy leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. I have private investigators on my payroll who charge $300 an hour, and they do not build evidentiary chains this clean, she said softly. You have essentially gift-wrapped a corporate conspiracy. I do not want them to just pay a fine, I stated, my voice completely devoid of any tremor. I want the people who hid the structural flaws to lose everything they have built. And I want the man who orchestrated the cover-up to be exposed in a way he can never legally undo. Marla closed the binder with a loud, satisfying snap. Then we do not make a single sound right now. We do not go to the local press. We do not give them the luxury of a warning. If Greyline realizes we have this specific internal audio, their IT department will suddenly experience a tragic, catastrophic server failure by midnight. We freeze the battlefield first. She immediately began drafting a massive, aggressive litigation hold. It was a formal legal directive demanding the absolute preservation of all corporate digital communications, text messages, private server logs, contractor emails, and internal security camera footage. It was designed to trap them. If they deleted a single comma after receiving that notice, we could instantly hit them with severe spoliation of evidence charges, effectively guaranteeing a jury would assume the destroyed documents proved their absolute guilt. Simultaneously, I returned to my municipal office and formally submitted a heavily detailed public records request. I demanded the unredacted copies of all safety compliance logs associated with the port renovation. I did this not because I needed the documents, but because I needed a documented legal avenue to introduce my evidence. I was meticulously building a legitimate paper trail so that every single file I pulled from my brother's silver drive would hold up under the brutal scrutiny of a civil courtroom. I was retaliating not with screaming matches, but with bureaucratic fire, while I was quietly arming a legal explosive under his entire career. Grant continued to aggressively play the role of the wounded, misunderstood partner. He realized I was not going to break my silence, so he initiated a covert smear campaign to control the social narrative. He began contacting our mutual friends, adopting a tone of deep, manufactured concern. My phone vibrated on a Thursday afternoon. A mutual friend forwarded me a screenshot from a private group chat. I opened the image and read Grant's words. I am honestly at a total loss, he had typed. Peyton is completely spiraling out of control from grief. She is refusing to have a civilized conversation with me. I am being aggressively punished just for missing a morning event to protect my own mental health. I want to be there for her, but I cannot deal with this toxic behavior. A morning event. He could not even type the word funeral. He reduced the burial of my brother to a minor scheduling inconvenience. The mutual friend who sent the screenshot added a hesitant message, asking if I was okay and suggesting I should perhaps talk to Grant to smooth things over. A week ago, I would have felt the burning, desperate need to defend myself. I would have typed out a massive, furious paragraph explaining exactly what kind of monster they were actually comforting. Instead, I took a screenshot of the image, saved it as a high-resolution file, and forwarded it directly to Marla. I did not reply to the friend. I did not post a single cryptic quote on social media. I let Grant talk. Every single lie he spun to our friends was a permanent, written record. By complaining about the funeral, Grant was inadvertently, legally establishing his exact motive and timeline. He was cementing his own absence as the absolute center of our conflict. blissfully unaware that I was about to use that exact absence to hang him. The killing blow, however, arrived 2 days later. Marla had sent the silver drive to an independent forensic data extraction firm to ensure the files were handled strictly by the book. They ran a deep-level recovery program to pull up the ghost data hidden in the background sectors of the drive. Marla called me on a secure line and simply told me to check my encrypted inbox. I opened the new file. It was a recovered fragment of an email that Grant had hastily typed on his phone and then permanently deleted. He had sent it directly to Leon Voss, the senior project manager. On the exact Friday night, he called me to cancel his attendance. I stared at the glowing white text on my monitor. Keep away from the Hughes service on Saturday. The place will be full of trade people. My lungs seized. The air rushed out of the room. I read the 2 sentences 3 times to ensure my eyes were not betraying me. It was not an explicit confession of murder, but in the context of a civil liability lawsuit, it was absolute, undeniable gold. It completely obliterated his entire public defense. It proved, in his own written words, that avoiding the funeral had absolutely nothing to do with sadness, depression, or psychological boundaries. He stayed away because he was terrified of being placed at the scene of the crime. He knew exactly what he was hiding, and he knew the workers from the port would recognize his face. I printed the email on a thick sheet of white paper. I put it into a manila folder, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to my parents' house in the suburbs. The house still smelled faintly of decaying lilies and heavy grief. I found my parents sitting quietly in the living room. My father was staring blankly at a muted television. My mother was clutching a tissue, her eyes red and endlessly weeping, lost in a perpetual state of mourning. I asked them to sit with me at the heavy oak dining table, the exact same table where Grant had left me alone to write the eulogy. I opened the manila folder. I did not sugarcoat a single detail. I walked them through the failed equipment logs, the delayed inspections, and the immense financial pressure Grayline was under to keep the site operational. I played the audio recording of Grant's voice echoing over the construction noise. Finally, I slid the printed copy of the deleted email across the smooth wood, pushing it directly toward my mother. My father read the documents, his face draining of all color. He closed his eyes, his jaw locking so tight the muscles jumped beneath his skin. He descended into a terrifying, vibrating silence. I looked at my mother. I expected her to collapse again. I expected a fresh, hysterical wave of tears. Instead, she stared at Grant's printed words for a very long time. I watched a profound, fundamental shift occur behind her eyes. The crippling sorrow that had paralyzed her for over a week instantly evaporated. It burned away, replaced by something ancient and fiercely maternal. She slowly lowered the piece of paper to the table. Her eyes were completely dry. The tears were gone. She looked directly at me, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a steel blade. Then do not let that bastard rewrite Evan's story. The social suffocation began almost immediately. When my absolute silence finally convinced Grant that his charm offensive had completely failed, he realized I was not just ignoring his text messages. Word of my formal public records request had inevitably snaked its way through the dense municipal bureaucracy, eventually ringing a quiet, urgent alarm bell on the executive floor of Grayline District Partners. He knew I was digging into the port project. Panic is a highly predictable emotion, and Grant reacted exactly the way a cornered narcissist always reacts when losing control. He launched a vicious, preemptive strike against my character. If he could not charm his way back into my apartment to monitor my actions, he would aggressively control the public narrative surrounding my mental state. He transitioned seamlessly from the role of the neglected but heartbroken lover into the deeply concerned, tragic figure burdened by an emotionally unstable ex-girlfriend. He weaponized my own grief against me, attempting to systematically isolate me from my own support system. He made his first massive, fatal miscalculation on a Tuesday afternoon. He sent a lengthy, beautifully crafted direct message to my mother on her private social media account. I was sitting at my kitchen island, organizing the newly printed compliance logs, when my mother forwarded the text directly to my phone. Grant wrote that he was entirely heartbroken over my current psychological decline. He claimed I was acting manic, aggressively spiraling out of control, and dangerously obsessed with creating baseless, paranoid conspiracy theories regarding the tragic accident at the port. He begged my parents to intervene immediately, suggesting they confiscate my phone and force me to get professional psychiatric help before I permanently embarrassed the family and ruined my own career. He honestly thought he was isolating a hysterical, grieving woman. He had absolutely no idea he was attempting to manipulate a fiercely protective mother who had just spent her entire Sunday evening staring at a printed, physical copy of his deleted email. My mother did not engage in a polite debate. She did not ask him for further clarification. She typed out a single, devastatingly cold reply. "Do not ever contact this family again. We know exactly why you did not attend the service." She hit send, permanently blocked his account across all platforms, and immediately called me to demand that I keep digging until I found every last piece of paper. Grant panicked. The perfectly polished facade he presented to the world was actively cracking under the pressure. The very next afternoon, an unfamiliar local number flashed on my cell phone screen. I answered it, instinctively tapping the record button on my secondary digital work tablet out of sheer, conditioned paranoia. It was Vanessa Mercer, Grant's older sister. She did not possess her brother's silver tongue or his calculated restraint. She was furious, her voice sharp, breathless, and vibrating with an aggressive, upper-class entitlement. "You need to stop this pathetic, vindictive witch hunt right now," Vanessa hissed through the tiny phone speaker. "My brother is a good, decent man. He loved you. And you are actively using your own brother's tragic accident as an excuse to ruin Grant's entire professional career, just because you are angry he needed to protect his own peace and could not handle a funeral. It is sick, Peyton. It is genuinely sick behavior." I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I let her yell. I let the heavy silence hang in the air between her accusations, creating a tense acoustic vacuum that her own anxiety forced her to fill. As an auditor, I learned long ago that people who are actively lying or covering up a truth will always talk too much if you just let them. "You have absolutely no idea how much pressure he is under at that firm," she continued, her breathing heavy and ragged, her anger making her entirely reckless. He tried to keep his distance from that specific site from the very beginning. He knew it was a total disaster waiting to happen, but it was his job to manage the investor optics. "You are trying to pin a random mechanical failure on a man who actively avoided the physical location." My finger hovered perfectly still over the stop button on my recording tablet. I let her words echo in the quiet space of my living room. She had just handed me a loaded weapon. In her blind, furious attempt to defend her brother's honor, Vanessa had accidentally, explicitly confirmed that Grant possessed prior knowledge of the hazardous conditions at the port. He knew it was a disaster waiting to happen, and he had clearly discussed that specific danger with his family long before the lift ever failed and took Evan's life. I ended the phone call without saying a single word in response. I instantly uploaded the audio file to Marla Kincaid's secure encrypted server. Within 15 minutes, my lawyer called me back. Her voice was practically purring with predatory satisfaction. She immediately added Vanessa Mercer's name to the primary list of hostile witnesses scheduled for the upcoming civil depositions. The pressure was intensifying, closing in from multiple sides. My apartment felt like a pressurized submarine, filled to the ceiling with printed emails, yellow legal pads, and the constant, suffocating anxiety of waiting for the next corporate attack. But the momentum was finally, undeniably shifting. The tight, impenetrable wall Grayline had built around the accident was beginning to fracture violently under the weight of its own internal lies. On Thursday morning, the massive breakthrough we desperately needed arrived directly on Marla's desk. The quiet whispers of Evan's family aggressively gathering evidence had inevitably circulated through the tight-knit local construction community. A man named Isaac Rowe proactively contacted my lawyer's office, requesting an immediate, strictly confidential meeting away from the city center. Isaac was the former lead safety compliance manager for the entire Port Alder renovation project. He was a 50-year-old industry veteran with a thick gray beard, exhausted shoulders, and tired, haunted eyes. He sat in Marla's glass-walled conference room, refusing to touch the expensive bottled water placed in front of him. He looked directly at me, his expression heavy with a profound, crushing guilt that mirrored my own grief. "I heard what your brother tried to do out there," Isaac said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I heard what those corporate suits are currently trying to do to you." He reached into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of stapled, slightly crumpled documents. It was not a forwarded email chain or a piece of second-hand rumor. It was the official, highly classified, unredacted minutes from a closed-door executive strategy meeting at Greyline District Partners. Isaac calmly explained that he had aggressively opposed the dangerously accelerated construction schedule from the very start. He had physically stood in the corporate boardroom and explicitly told the executives that the heavy industrial freight lift was operating completely outside of its safe mechanical parameters. The documents he slid across the polished mahogany table proved, in stark black and white ink, that Greyline's senior leadership knew the lift explicitly required a mandatory operational shutdown exactly 11 days before my brother was killed. "They completely ignored me," Isaac said, his voice dropping to a harsh, raspy whisper. "They told the primary contractor to just reevaluate the risk themselves and keep pushing the daily timeline to satisfy the investors. When I threatened to blow the whistle to the state board, they forced my early resignation. They paid me a massive severance package, attached a ruthless non-disclosure agreement, and threw me out the door. But I kept a hard copy of the minutes. I hid them. I could not sleep after I saw the evening news about Evan. I picked up the meeting minutes. The paper felt heavier than solid lead in my hands. I traced my index finger over the printed dates, aligning them perfectly with the massive timeline spreadsheet I had built in my kitchen. The circle was entirely complete. I looked out the massive windows of the law firm, watching the busy city streets far below. Grant Mercer was no longer fighting a lonely, grieving woman he could easily gaslight and emotionally discard. The invisible trap had sprung. He was completely surrounded. He was firmly caught in a tightening net, woven from his own deleted emails. His sister's arrogant recorded phone call, a brave whistleblowing safety manager, and an impenetrable wall of hard physical evidence. His slick, polished words and expensive suits were entirely useless against the crushing gravity of a documented paper trail. For the first time in weeks, the air in my lungs finally felt clear. The machinery of the city operates on strict, predictable schedules. Greyline District Partners was running entirely out of time, and their desperation forced them out of the shadows and into the glaring fluorescent light of the municipal bureaucracy. On a brisk Monday morning, the City Port Development Board officially announced a mandatory public hearing. Greyline had formally requested a massive, highly controversial schedule extension for Phase 2 of the coastal warehouse renovation project. They needed the City Council to legally excuse their delays and authorize the release of the next massive tier of public funding. The timing was nothing short of miraculous. Marla Kincaid had just finished perfectly collating the final evidentiary exhibits for our civil lawsuit regarding wrongful death and deliberate safety obstruction. When she saw the public notice for the Development Board hearing, she immediately halted the standard electronic filing process. She called me into her office and laid out a remarkably vicious, flawless strategy. If we quietly filed the lawsuit through the standard municipal clerk on a random weekday, Greyline would immediately deploy their army of corporate defense attorneys. They would file immediate injunctions, slap emergency gag orders on every single document, and bury the truth under a mountain of sealed procedural motions. Grant would simply retreat behind his heavily fortified legal department and continue making quiet, persuasive phone calls to sympathetic city planners. But a public city council hearing was an entirely different battleground. It was an open, legally mandated forum. It was a live microphone with public stenographers, independent oversight committees, and local press sitting in the front row. Marla recognized that if we struck at that exact moment, Grant would have absolutely nowhere to hide. He could not control the lighting, he could not edit the transcript, and he could not rely on his corporate handlers to shield him from the blast radius. The tension in my apartment grew thick and heavy as the hearing approached. Every single piece of evidence was locked into place. I spent my evenings methodically reviewing the color-coded spreadsheets, committing dates, times, and contractor names to memory. I was operating in a state of absolute, hyper-focused coldness. Then, exactly 48 hours before the scheduled hearing, a new variable slid perfectly into the equation. I was sitting at my kitchen island late on a Thursday evening, reviewing a witness list, when I heard a soft, distinct rustle at my front door. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy paper brushing against the hardwood floor. I walked to the entryway and found a blank, unmarked manila envelope resting just beneath the doorframe. I picked it up, ensured the hallway outside was completely empty, and brought it over to the bright pendant lights of the kitchen. I did not rush. I carefully sliced the top edge open and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock printer paper. It was a printed screenshot of an internal corporate calendar. Specifically, it was a detailed, hour-by-hour view of Grant Mercer's professional schedule for the exact Saturday morning of my brother's funeral. The digital calendar blocks were entirely empty. He had cleared his schedule. But someone had taken a thick blue ink pen and scrawled a series of hurried, highly specific notes across the white space of that Saturday morning. I read the 4 handwritten sentences, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Avoid service, union faces, apprentice girl, mother may ask questions. There was no signature at the bottom of the page. There was no return address, but I did not need a confession to verify its authenticity. I immediately pulled the binder containing the whistleblowing documents provided by Isaac Rowe. I cross-referenced the alphanumeric routing code printed in the microscopic margin at the very bottom of the calendar page. The server identification numbers matched Grayline's internal network architecture perfectly. The specific font and the layout of the digital interface were identical. Someone inside the glass tower was quietly bleeding information. Someone deeply embedded in Grayline's corporate structure had realized the ship was rapidly taking on water, and they were actively, anonymously throwing Grant overboard to save their own skin. I stared at the heavy blue ink. I looked at the words union faces and apprentice girl, confirming his absolute terror of being placed at the scene by Tessa Vale or the other workers. But it was the final sentence that made my hands curl into tight, aching fists. Mother may ask questions. I stood perfectly still, breathing in slow, measured counts to keep my heart rate from exploding. I did not throw a glass against the wall. I did not scream into the empty apartment. I simply absorbed the profound, staggering sociopathy of those 5 words. Grant did not just fear the blue-collar workers who might recognize him. He had actively, clinically categorized my mother's shattered, weeping soul as a public relations liability. He viewed a grieving parent desperate for answers about her dead son as a highly dangerous interrogation risk that needed to be strategically dodged. I took a clear plastic sleeve from my desk, gently slid the anonymous printout inside, and snapped it into the primary evidence binder. Every single piece of the puzzle was now sitting on the table, heavily armed and ready to detonate. The absolute confirmation of his panic arrived the very next night. Just hours before we were scheduled to walk into the municipal building, it was past 10 o'clock in the evening. My cell phone vibrated on the nightstand. The screen displayed an unknown caller identification number. I knew exactly who it was. I swiped the screen to answer and held the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. If you go through with whatever insane stunt you are planning tomorrow, you are going to regret it for the rest of your life, Grant said. His voice was entirely unrecognizable. The smooth, polished cadence he used for investor pitches and dinner dates was completely gone. His tone was jagged, raw, and vibrating with an ugly, cornered malice. He was no longer playing the role of the decent, misunderstood man. The mask had fully slipped, revealing the terrified corporate animal underneath. I know you have been talking to the union, Grant hissed, the panic bleeding through the cellular connection. I know you are trying to build some ridiculous negligence narrative, but if you blow this up in front of the city board, Peyton, I swear to God, Grayline's legal department will rip your brother's employment record to shreds. They will pull every minor infraction he ever had. They will claim he was negligent. They will claim he was totally incompetent and ignored basic protocols. If you try to make a scene tomorrow, you are going to drag Evan's name into a dirty, public mudslinging contest, and you will single-handedly destroy his entire memory. He was threatening me with the ghost of the man he helped kill. He was utilizing the exact same psychological leverage he used to silence subcontractors, betting entirely on my emotional fragility. He firmly believed I would back down to protect my family from a brutal corporate smear campaign. I did not raise my voice. I did not launch into a passionate defense of my brother's flawless work ethic. I did not tell him about the recovered emails, the safety minutes, or the anonymous calendar printout sitting in my bag. I kept my voice as cold and flat as a sheet of winter ice. I just have one question for you, Grant, I said quietly. He stopped breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for the demand he thought he could negotiate. Did you not come to the funeral because you felt sad, or because you were afraid someone would see you? The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum pressing against the speaker of my phone. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. He did not offer a polished excuse. He did not attempt to gaslight me with a manufactured speech about his mental health boundaries. He simply hung up the phone. The line went dead, leaving a hollow dial tone echoing in my dark bedroom. I lowered the phone from my ear and set it gently on the wooden nightstand. That 3-second span of absolute terrified silence was not just a failure to answer, it was a complete, undeniable confession. The time for investigating was officially over. Tomorrow morning, we were going to war. The fluorescent lights of the city council chambers buzzed with a dull institutional hum. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. The room was packed with city planners, local journalists, union representatives, and corporate executives. Grant walked through the heavy oak double doors wearing an absolutely flawless charcoal gray suit. His posture was perfect. His expression was carefully sculpted into a mask of solemn, professional resilience. He was prepared to stand at the mahogany podium and smoothly dismiss my brother's violent death as a tragic, unavoidable anomaly. He was there to secure the schedule extension and keep the money flowing. He took his seat at the petitioner's table, arranging his presentation folders with practiced elegance. He did not look at the back row where my parents and I sat in complete stone-cold silence. He never even made it to the microphone. Before the presiding council member could formally invite Grayline District partners to present their case, Marla Kincaid stood up from the front row. She did not ask for permission to speak. She walked directly to the central clerk's desk, carrying 5 massive, identical black binders. "Mr. Chairman," Marla announced, her voice ringing out like a gunshot in the cavernous room. "On behalf of the Hughes family, we are formally submitting an emergency evidentiary injunction to this council, the attending union delegates, the primary project insurers, and the state occupational safety investigators seated in the gallery." The chairman frowned, adjusting his glasses. "Counselor, this is a scheduling hearing. If you have a civil grievance, there are proper channels. This board is currently being asked to authorize municipal funds based on fraudulent safety compliance." Marla countered sharply, handing the first binder directly to the lead insurance underwriter sitting nearby. "The documents contained in these files demonstrate a coordinated, fatal cover-up orchestrated by the executives requesting this extension." Grant's perfect posture instantly shattered. His head snapped toward Marla, all the blood violently draining from his face. Marla did not hesitate. She addressed the entire chamber, listing the contents of the binder with brutal surgical precision. She publicly entered the recovered deleted email into the public record. She cited the unredacted internal meeting minutes. She submitted the audio file of Grant explicitly pressuring an electrician to ignore a failing structural load. She filed the transcript of his sister's panicked phone call. And finally, she submitted the printed calendar page, detailing exactly why the Director of External Relations was too terrified to attend a grieving family's memorial service. The air in the room completely evaporated. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of heavy cardstock pages turning as the board members frantically opened their copies of the dossier. Grant scrambled to his feet, his hands gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles turned white. "This is an outrageous ambush," he stammered, his polished baritone voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch. "These are fabricated allegations brought by a grieving, unstable individual. This has absolutely no bearing on the zoning request." "It has every bearing," a deep, rough voice boomed from the center aisle. Isaac Rowe stood up. The former safety compliance manager looked directly at the city council panel, completely ignoring Grayline's frantic legal team. "My name is Isaac Rowe. I was the lead safety director for this project. I explicitly warned the executive board about the failing freight lift exactly 11 days before it collapsed. They buried my report and forced my resignation to protect their capital funding." Before the room could even absorb the shockwave of Isaac's testimony, another figure stood up in the back row. Tessa Vale, wearing her heavy canvas work jacket, pointed a shaking but determined finger directly at Grant. "That is the man," Tessa declared, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "He came to the site the week before the accident. I saw him with my own eyes. He cornered Evan on the second floor and told him to stop making a big deal out of the faulty machinery." The atmosphere in the chamber violently and irreversibly shifted. The collective realization washed over the crowd like a freezing tidal wave. This was no longer a tragic story about an emotionally stunted boyfriend who simply disliked the depressing energy of a funeral. The polished, therapy-speak excuses he had peddled to our friends were instantly exposed for what they truly were. They were the desperate, cowardly deflections of a man who was actively complicit in the cover-up that led to a brutal, preventable death. Grant looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a friendly face. He found none. The union representatives were staring at him with absolute, unmasked hatred. The insurance underwriters were already aggressively typing on their phones, frantically signaling their home offices to freeze all project payouts. Grant tried to speak again, opening his mouth to spin another lie, but the chairman aggressively slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. "This hearing is immediately suspended," the chairman barked, his face flushed with anger. "No further extensions will be granted. The municipal funding is frozen effective immediately, pending a full criminal inquiry by the state." Within 60 seconds, the entire corporate facade crumbled. Grayline's lead counsel practically dragged Grant away from the table, loudly whispering that he was a massive liability. By 3 o'clock that same afternoon, Grayline District Partners issued a brief, sterile press release stating that their Director of External Relations had been placed on indefinite administrative leave to serve an ongoing independent investigation. The fallout over the next several weeks was absolute and highly destructive. The civil lawsuit was formally docketed in the state Supreme Court. The Occupational Safety Board completely reopened the site investigation, immediately dragging the senior project manager into hours of hostile recorded depositions. The pristine, untouchable reputation Grant had spent his entire adult life building through polite networking, expensive dinners, and slick empty words was entirely dismantled by a relentless chain of official municipal paperwork. He lost his high six-figure salary. He lost his corner office. He lost the only thing he ever truly cared about, which was his own perfect image. The final, emotional conclusion to the nightmare did not happen in a sterile courtroom or a crowded city hall. It happened exactly 40 days after Evan passed away. My family hosted a small, quiet memorial gathering in my parents' backyard. The massive crowds from the funeral were gone. It was just the people who truly loved him. We stood around the old brick fire pit, drinking cheap domestic beer, completely ignoring the brisk autumn wind. I stood up and pulled a small, worn piece of lined notebook paper from my coat pocket. I looked at my parents, who were holding hands, their faces still etched with sorrow but no longer paralyzed by unanswered questions. I looked at Tessa, who offered a small, brave nod. I cleared my throat and read the final sentence my brother ever wrote to me. If anything happens to me, do not let them turn it into a normal accident. I carefully folded the piece of paper and put it back into my pocket. I did not deliver a dramatic, triumphant speech about victory. I did not talk about moving on, healing, or getting back into the dating scene. The victory was cold, heavy, and fundamentally exhausting. It did not magically bring Evan back to our Sunday evening phone calls, but as I stood there in the fading evening light, I felt a profound, deeply settled quiet inside my chest. I had buried my brother once in the dark, heavy earth, but in the very end, using the exact rules and the exact rigid order of the world I lived in, I had entirely refused to let them bury the truth right alongside him. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories, like this video, and support us even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by as many people as possible.